James Cameron's story of science fiction is a great one-season, 6-episode series that originally aired on AMC almost exactly 1 year ago. James Cameron explores science fiction as a genre by interviewing a few of its modern caretakers. I highly recommend it. While Cameron did have an extensive discussion with George Lucas, not all of that discussion could be used in the episode because of time restraints, obviously, so a companion book was released alongside the show. And in that companion book, George Lucas briefly talked about his idea for the sequel trilogy. Here's a conversation between James Cameron and George Lucas, and then we'll discuss. Quote, "Everybody hated it in Phantom Menace when we started to talk about midi-chlorians. There's a whole aspect to that movie that is about symbiotic relationships, to make you look and see that we aren't the boss, that there's an ecosystem here." James Cameron, "There's an ecosystem inside us called the microbiome that they're just learning about now." George Lucas, "The next 3 films were going to get into a microbiotic world, but there's this world of creatures that operate differently than we do. I call them the Whills. And the Whills are the ones who actually control the universe. They feed off the Force." James Cameron, "You were creating a religion, George." George Lucas, "Back in the day, I used to say ultimately what this means is we were just cars, vehicles for the Whills to travel around in. We're vessels for them. And the conduit is the Midi-chlorians. The Midi-chlorians are the ones that communicate with the Whills. The Whills, in a general sense, they are the Force." James Cameron, "But you're putting detail and a facade of science around an idea that's pretty timeless, which is the spirit, the soul, heaven, causation. But in your world building, you're going back to archetypes, which is spirit, the Godhead, all that sort of thing." George Lucas, "All the way back to, with the Force and the Jedi and everything, the whole concept of how things happen was laid out completely from the beginning to end, but I never got to finish. I never got to tell people about it." Close quote. You know, I always have to take things with a big spoonful of salt when we're talking about Star Wars and things being planned out. Sure, maybe the basic ideas have been ping-ponging around for decades in his head, and we all know about the Journal of the Whills, and Whills basically becoming the Force from a production standpoint. But things have always changed, been completely scrapped. And in the history of Star Wars, for anyone who's been paying attention to decades of production, have never really been close to being 100% hashed out from the beginning. We've heard a lot of ideas of what could have been come and go. What was planned, scrapped, and replaced. In 1997, Lucas said, quote, "Originally I was trying to have the story be told by somebody else, an immortal being known as a Whill. There was somebody watching this whole story and recording it, somebody probably wiser than the mortal players in the actual events. I eventually dropped this idea and the concept behind the Whills turned into the Force. But the Whills became part of this massive amount of notes, quotes, background information that I used for the scripts. The stories were actually taken from the Journal of the Whills." Close quote. Exploring the microbiotic world is interesting as a concept. When Lucas says he was gonna get into the microbiotic world, for whatever reason, my dumb brain pictures a movie where we're just watching cells under a microscope. Now, obviously, that wouldn't be the case at all. That sounds stupid as shit. I'm sure the theme of midi-chlorians and the Whills would have been layered on top of an adventure flick. But I'm very curious how all of this would have gone over. Movies about fate and kind of a lack of free will, everything being planned out, causation, everything is out of your control. A sequel trilogy that, from what I can tell, would be about systems of control from the macro to the micro. And while that is, an incredibly interesting and philosophical discussion to have, I know Star Wars fans, and as Lucas said, we all shit our britches when midi-chlorians became a thing. Well, he didn't exactly say that, but we did. We shit our britches. And hey, we know that Lucas consulted numerous times on the sequel trilogy, and it's possible that this idea is present in the sequel trilogy, perhaps more subtly than Lucas envisioned. But I mean, does everybody need everything spelled out from A to Z? Can't we have a little bit of mystery? Do you need a character to literally say there's Whills that control midi-chlorians, and the midi-chlorians dictate the Force? Do you need that? Do you need a character to just turn to the camera and say that? Not everything needs to be spelled out. Overall, as a subtle concept, I like the idea of sprinkling some of this on top of a fun adventure romp, which maybe it has been, who knows, but if it was the main focus, if the microbiotic world was to be the front and center end of the Star Wars saga and the sequel trilogy, where we talk about a lack of free will, where we talk about beings controlling destinies extensively, well, I'd probably be clutching my original trilogy even tighter. Now, there's one thing that I found a little goofy about this conversation, and it's when Lucas says, quote, "I never got to finish. I never got to tell people about it," close quote. You know, I love you to death, George, but you had a long time. You had 40 years, and you sold the company.